Suppose there was some very sure way, some very non-demanding way of bringing about the death of every sentient being on this planet. For example, by causing the planet to explode at the push of a button, something of this sort. And would an act of this kind be justified? And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm largely going to be ignoring practical questions about this, such as how this might conceivably be done, whether it would be politically feasible, questions like that. Those are interesting and legitimate questions. They're not what I'll be focusing on. First of all, I'm going to be assuming here that life on this planet is, on the whole, very bad, and that we should want it to end. Obviously, for many people, this is a highly controversial assumption, but I think if one really considers how bad the bad things in this world are, and how common they are, they'd actually be led to a similar view. And from this perspective, the analogy of war is a good one. Because on the whole, war is a bad condition for the world to be in. We want wars to end. And it's regrettable, but I think often true of such conflicts, that the only way realistically to hasten their end is through the use of violence. So imagine a global war, and we're reasonably certain that this war can be ended quickly by killing 10,000 individuals now. On the other hand, if we allow the war to continue until a more peaceful settlement is reached, the cumulative result will foreseeably be the even worse drawn-out death of more than 1 million individuals. Assuming better alternatives are not open to us, would ending the war by the violent means be justified? I think if we make these assumptions, it would be justified. And I think the argument is fundamentally no different for bringing about the end of life on Earth, even if this were to involve some additional suffering to the last generation. So the basic argument for pressing the button can be stated in just a few words. It's an evil that is necessary to avoid an even worse evil. This view, however, has not been uncontroversial. Now, I think at bottom, what really divides people on this question is a distinction, much discussed and debated, between doing harm and allowing harm. There are many ways one might state this general thought, but roughly it's this: it is morally worse, other things being equal, to bring about some foreseen bad outcome by performing an act than it is to fail to act and thereby allowing the same foreseen bad outcome. So to take an example of this, we think it's seriously wrong to go into a hospital and shoot and kill a random patient. Whereas we normally don't consider it seriously wrong not to donate, say, a kidney, even when, let's say, we know that we can do this and that failing to do so will result in the death of a patient who could have been saved by this act of assistance. Now, this seems to suggest a moral difference between doing harm, in the example I just gave, shooting a patient, and allowing the same harm, failing to prevent the death of a patient by donating an organ. And one might likewise argue that in the case we're considering, one is not or is less morally responsible for all the future harms that one allows by not pressing the button than the evils that, if you like, one directly causes by pressing the button. And many philosophers, however, especially those of a more utilitarian turn of mind, those who think what we really ought to do is maximize the good and minimize the bad, have rejected this distinction. And one way philosophers have challenged this is by arguing that the difference between doing and allowing is not what is crucial, that in fact there are other differences between these sorts of cases that explain our different reactions to them. So one difference, for example, is that it is easier not to shoot someone than it is to save someone by donating a kidney. The latter takes effort to go and get all the necessary tests done, to undergo surgery and so forth. Whereas it generally takes no effort at all not to go into a hospital and kill someone. And so it's much easier generally to fulfill our negative duties, our duties of non-interference, as they're sometimes called, than it is to fulfill positive duties of not allowing harm to come to others when we're in a position to prevent these harms. Another likely difference between shooting someone and failing to donate an organ is the motive of the agent. And this may also influence how we assess the two cases. Typically, when one goes out of their way to kill someone, one is motivated by some desire to see that individual dead, whereas one's failure to donate a kidney is not similarly motivated. Accordingly, in order to properly assess the doing and allowing distinction, one has to consider a pair of cases to compare in which these other variables are held constant. That is, where the agent's motive is identical and the effort required to prevent harm is minimal. And so consider the following cases. Suppose A wants B dead, and A pushes B off a cliff. Now imagine an alternative scenario in which, again, A wants B dead. Luckily for A, however, B faints for some reason or other, in which A played no part, and is very slowly drifting toward the edge of a cliff. A, seeing this, can easily prevent B from sliding down any farther, but does not. B eventually falls off the cliff. Now, if we think there's an important moral difference between doing and allowing, we should think A's behavior is objectionable in the first case, but less so in the second. And this just strikes me as implausible. It seems to me that A's behavior is morally equivalent in the two cases, even though one involves a doing of harm, the other an allowing of harm. We should therefore, it seems to me, think that there's no moral difference per se between the harm one does and the harm one allows. But now, if we're right about this, it seems one would need to say that the harm that one foreseeably allows by not pressing the button should not be discounted on account of this difference. On the contrary, it should be given the same moral weight and consideration, because it's, after all, just as easy to press the button as it is to refrain from pressing it, or assume that. And so if we also assume that there's no better way open to the agent of bringing about the death of all sentient beings, the end of life on this planet, then I think failing to press the button would be wrong. Of course, at the moment, this is a hypothetical example, and you might think it will remain hypothetical, but regardless of what one thinks about that, one thing these examples can do is bring out these important areas of moral disagreement, which then do apply very directly to many current and pressing moral issues.